The dust came up yellow from the east, and Sheriff Morgan Blake could taste it on his teeth. 3 months of tracking, 3 months of following cold trails and older lies, and now Jack Sullivan sat shackled beside him on a borrowed mare. Silent as stone, Blake's own horse moved steady beneath him. Unbothered by the weight of justice being served, they turned into the yard just as the wind picked up. Blake saw the cabin first logs gone gray with age and weather. Roofs sagging in the middle like a broken promise, chickens scratched in dirt that looked too hard to yield anything. An empty bucket sat by the well. Rust-colored and forgotten, this was where outlaws came from, Blake thought. This poverty, this desperation. He'd seen it before. The mothers were always one of two kinds, hard women who'd raised their sons to take what they couldn't earn, or fool women too simple to see what their boys had become. The cabin door opened. The woman who emerged wasn't what Blake expected. She wore a dress faded nearly colorless by sun and washing, but it was clean. Her hair, more gray than brown, was pulled back neat. She stood straight despite her years, and when her eyes found her son in shackles, she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't rush forward with pleas. Blake had heard 100 times before. She simply nodded. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff," she said. Blake dismounted, keeping one hand near his pistol out of habit. Jack sat motionless on the mare, head slightly bowed. Blake studied the woman's face, trying to read what kind of trouble she might cause. Her eyes were clear, intelligent. That was the first surprise. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Morgan Blake out of Dusty Creek. I'm taking your son to Prescott to stand trial for robbery of the Tucson stage." He let the words sit heavy between them. "He'll likely hang." The woman's face showed pain then, swift and deep. But she didn't look away. "I understand, Sheriff. I'll need to water my horses, Blake said. "Then we'll be on our way." "Before you go," the woman said quietly, "would you share a meal? Even a condemned man's mother deserves to offer hospitality." Blake wanted to refuse. Keeping distance made duty simpler. 3 months he'd tracked Jack Sullivan. 3 months of sleeping rough and asking questions in towns that didn't want a lawman's attention. He'd earned the right to finish this clean. But something in her tone, not begging, not manipulating, just stating a simple truth, made refusal feel like cowardice. 1 hour, Blake said. "No more." The woman nodded again and turned toward the cabin. Blake noticed she moved with a kind of dignity poverty hadn't managed to take from her. The dust storm was building on the horizon, yellowing the sky like old paper. He could feel it coming in the way the wind shifted. Jack finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "You don't have to do this, Mama." "Hush, Kadi, son," the woman said without turning. "I know what I have to do." Blake helped Jack down from the mare, the chains rattling between them. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet yard. He tied both horses to the rail and followed the woman inside, one hand still resting on his gun belt. The cabin's interior was spare but clean. A table scrubbed smooth by years of use. 2 chairs that didn't match, shelves nearly bare except for a few jars of preserved vegetables and a single book, a Bible. Blake saw, worn soft at the edges from constant reading, the kind of poverty that came from circumstance, not from laziness. Blake felt the first tremor of something he didn't want to name. Doubt, maybe, or just weariness. "Sit, Sheriff Chuma," the woman said, and gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll prepare something." Blake sat. Through the window, he watched the dust storm building. Moving closer, Jack remained on the porch, shackled to the post. The wind began to pick up, rattling the cabin's walls with a sound like distant drums. The woman moved through her small space with quiet competence, and Blake found himself watching her hands. They were rough from work but steady, the hands of someone who'd survived things that should have broken her. "I'm Ruth Sullivan," she said as she set a pot on the stove, "and I thank you for agreeing to share our table, Sheriff Blake." Our table, as if her son wasn't sitting in chains outside, waiting for the rope. Blake shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of his gun belt, his badge, the weight of certainty he'd carried for 15 years. It felt heavier than it should, like armor he'd forgotten how to remove. Outside, the wind rose. Inside, Ruth Sullivan began to hum softly as she worked, and Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed a threshold he didn't fully understand. The meal Ruth set before him was simple cornbread, beans, preserved vegetables that must have come from last year's garden. She didn't apologize for its meagerness. She placed the food on the table as if it were a feast, then went to the door. "Jack, come in and eat." Blake tensed. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Sheriff Gigis, you're armed and he's shackled. Surely you can allow a condemned man one last meal with his mother." It wasn't a request. Not really. Blake nodded slowly. Ruth brought Jack inside. Seated him at the table, the chains clinked against the chair legs. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the wind battering the cabin walls. "Jack was not born bad, Sheriff," Ruth said finally, her voice calm as if discussing the weather. "I won't insult your intelligence by claiming he's innocent. He did what you charge him with, but I ask you to see the whole story before you finish it." Blake set down his spoon. "Ma'am, the law doesn't require me to understand why a man breaks it, only that he did." Ruth met his eyes across the table. In the dim light, Blake could see how educated those eyes were, how much thought lived behind them. "Then the law is a poor instrument for justice, Sheriff Blake." The words hit like a slap. 15 years Blake had worn a badge. 15 years of being fair but firm, of treating all men the same under the law. No one had ever questioned whether his understanding of justice was sufficient. No one had dared. "My son returned from Confederate service in the spring of 1866, Ruth continued, unfazed by Blake's silence. "He was 21 years old. The boy who left was gentle, Sheriff, afraid of hurting things. He cried when our dog died, and he was 17 years old, then not ashamed of his tears." Blake glanced at Jack. The man sat with his head bowed, jaw tight. The boy who came back wasn't the same. Ruth said quietly, "Nightmares, long silences. I didn't know then what war does to men's minds. I thought time would heal him." She paused, looking down at her plate. "But time heals nothing when you're poor and the world has decided you're not worth a chance." "He chose crime," Blake said, but his voice lacked the certainty he wanted it to carry. "He chose survival," Ruth corrected. "After his father died of fever and the farm was raided, after every merchant in town refused him work because of his war record, after good Christian men spat at his feet for fighting for what he believed in." Her voice remained steady, but Blake heard the pain beneath it. "Desperation makes beasts of good men. Sheriff, my son became what the world demanded of him." Blake wanted to argue, wanted to explain that plenty of men faced hardship without turning to robbery, but the words wouldn't come. He'd served in the Union Army himself, seen what war did to soldiers on both sides. He'd watched former comrades drink themselves to death, trying to drown memories that wouldn't stay buried. Jack spoke for the second time, his voice low. "Mama, don't. He deserves to know the truth. Son." "The truth is, I robbed that stage," Jack said, finally raising his head to look at Blake. "I knew it was wrong when I did it. That's the only truth that matters to the law." Blake studied Jack's face, saw the exhaustion there, the weight of more than just chains. Ruth was right about one thing: this wasn't a hard man. This was a broken one. The dust storm hit the cabin walls suddenly, violently. The sound was like drums now, like thunder. Ruth stood to check the door latch, moving with that same quiet competence. Blake watched her and thought, this woman taught her son to read. She kept this cabin clean despite having almost nothing. She maintained her dignity when most would have crumbled. What kind of law was he serving if it couldn't see any of that? "More cornbread?" Sheriff T. Ruth asked, as if they'd been discussing nothing more troubling than the weather. Blake shook his head. His appetite had gone. Outside. The wind screamed. Inside. The silence felt heavier than before. Ruth cleared the plates, and Blake knew he should leave now. Should get Jack back on the horse and ride hard for Prescott before this woman's quiet dignity did any more damage to his certainty. But the storm raged, and Blake found he couldn't stand, not yet. The dust storm settled into a steady assault against the cabin. Blake knew they'd have to wait it out riding, and this would be dangerous for the horses, impossible for navigation. Ruth seemed to accept this without comment, moving to put coffee on the stove. Real coffee. Blake could smell it. That must have cost her dearly. "I visit the prisoners in Prescott, Sheriff to," Ruth said as she poured. "Every month, I bring what I can, food, books, writing materials." Blake took the cup she offered, surprised by the warmth of it in his hands. "I didn't know that. The men never tell their captors about the old woman who believes redemption remains possible." She smiled faintly. "Some of them you brought in yourself." Blake thought of the prisoners he'd delivered over the years. Hard men, most of them, or so he'd believed. "Why do you do it?" Ruth sat across from him, her own cup cradled in work-worn hands. "Because I raised a son who became an outlaw despite my teaching. That means either I failed completely, or circumstances can overwhelm good upbringing." She met his eyes. "If the second is true, and I must believe it is, Sheriff, or I couldn't bear my own reflection, then redemption must be possible for all of us." She stood and went to a small shelf, retrieving something wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Blake saw letters, maybe a dozen, tied with string. "Jack writes me from his prison terms," Ruth said, placing the bundle on the table between them. "Would you read them, Sheriff?" "Not for mercy. I'm not asking you to break your law, but for understanding." Blake hesitated. Reading a prisoner's letters felt like crossing another line, entering territory that had nothing to do with his duty. But Ruth's eyes held his, and he found himself reaching for the bundle. The first letter was 3 years old, written from a Tucson jail. The handwriting was careful, educated. Ruth had taught him well. "Dear Mama," it began, "I have become what you tried to save me from becoming. The judge says 6 months for theft. I won't argue. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I don't know how to climb back to who I was. Every choice I make seems to lead further down this path. I'm sorry. Mama, I'm so sorry." Blake read 3 more letters, each similar in tone. Full confession, deep remorse, no excuses, no blame, just a man drowning in shame, reaching out to the one person who still saw him as human. This wasn't how hardened criminals wrote. This wasn't the voice of a man without conscience. "I don't ask you to free him, Sheriff," Ruth said quietly. "I ask you to see him whole before you end him." Blake set the letters down carefully, as if they might break. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, he felt something in his chest cracking like dried leather in rain. All his certainty, all his clean understanding of law and order and justice, it was crumbling under the weight of these words written in careful script by a man who knew he was lost but couldn't stop falling. Ruth stood and went to the door, where the empty bucket sat. She filled it from a pitcher of water, then used that water to refill the coffee pot. Blake watched her transform the empty vessel into something useful, something that served. "The storm will pass," Ruth said. "It always does, but what we do while it rages, that's what defines us. Sheriff Blake." Jack sat silent on the porch, visible through the window. His shoulders were hunched. Whether from cold or shame, Blake couldn't tell. Maybe both. Blake thought about the years he'd spent enforcing law, all the prisoners delivered, all the trials attended, all the sentences carried out. How many of them had he seen whole? How many had he judged without ever asking why the law is a poor instrument for justice? Ruth's words echoed in his mind as the storm raged on. Dawn came gray and cold. The dust had settled somewhat, but the wind still moved restless across the yard. Blake had spent the night on Ruth's floor, she'd insisted, and the storm had made travel impossible. He'd barely slept. Listening to the wind and thinking about those letters, Ruth was already up, preparing breakfast. The smell of cornmeal and coffee filled the small cabin. Jack remained on the porch, where he'd spent the night. Blake had checked on him twice. Some instinct he couldn't name, making sure the man was warm enough. Had water. When had he started thinking of Jack Sullivan as a man instead of just a prisoner? "Tell me about before the war," Blake said as they ate. The word surprised him. He hadn't planned to ask, but Ruth had opened something in him last night. Some need to understand that he'd kept locked away for 15 years. Ruth's face softened. Jack was gentle. As I said. His father died when Jack was 15. Fever took him in 3 days. Jack became the man of our farm too young. She paused, remembering. He used to read to me in the evenings, from the Bible. Mostly it's the only book we had. But he'd read the same passages and find new meaning each time. He had a gift for that, for seeing deeper. Blake thought of the careful handwriting in those letters, the education that showed through despite everything. When the war came, he believed in it. Ruth continued, believed he was fighting for something righteous. He was 19 years old. Sheriff, old enough to die but too young to understand what dying meant. Her voice grew quieter. He came back different. The nightmares I'd wake to hear him screaming, and the silences, days where he wouldn't speak at all. I didn't know then that his mind had been broken same as some men's bodies. Blake knew this story. He'd lived a version of it himself. Coming home from Union service with memories that still woke him some nights. The difference was he'd had opportunities. He'd been on the winning side. He'd found work as a deputy, then a sheriff. The law had saved him by giving him purpose. What saved men who fought for the losing side, men whose service marked them as traitors in their own country. Jobs were scarce for everyone after the war, Ruth said, but for Confederate veterans, merchants would spit at Jack's feet. Good Christian men. Sheriff, church-going men who preached forgiveness on Sunday and spat on broken soldiers on Monday. The bitterness in her voice was the first real anger Blake had heard from her. He tried. For 2 years, he tried to find honest work, but no one would hire him. And then, Blake asked, though he could guess. Then I got sick, 5 years ago. Fever, like what took his father. I needed medicine. Needed food to keep my strength up. Jack had no money, no prospects. Ruth's voice cracked for the first time. I begged him not to, told him I'd rather die honestly than live on stolen goods. But he did it anyway. She looked directly at Blake, and he saw tears in her eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. I took the medicine. Sheriff, I took it and lived, so whose hands are clean? The question sat between them like an accusation. Blake had no answer. How did you calculate guilt when survival demanded sin? How did you judge a son who committed crime to save his mother's life? Jack's voice came from the porch, rough with emotion. I made my choices, Meta. Mama, don't carry my weight. We all carry each other's weight. Son, Ruth said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. That's what it means to be human. Blake stood and walked to the window. The sun was rising now, burning off the last of the dust. The empty bucket by the well caught the light, its rust-colored surface gleaming. He thought about his own father, a lawman who'd believed in rigid certainty until it cost him his family. Blake's mother had left when Blake was 12, unable to live with a man who saw the world only in absolutes. Blake had become a sheriff to honor his father's legacy, but which legacy? The badge, or the loneliness that came with refusing to see people whole. I should get him to Prescott, Blake said finally. Ruth nodded. Yes, you should. But as Blake gathered his things, he felt the weight of everything he'd learned pressing down on him. The law required him to deliver Jack Sullivan for trial. But what did justice require? He didn't know anymore, and that uncertainty felt more honest than any certainty he'd ever claimed. The sun was well up by the time Blake had the horses ready. He should have left an hour ago. Should be putting miles between himself and this cabin and the woman who'd somehow turned his world sideways in the space of a night. But Ruth stopped him at the door. One more meal, Sheriff, she said. Before you take my son to die. It wasn't manipulation. It was simple truth stated plainly. Blake found himself nodding. They sat again at the worn table. Ruth served the last of her cornbread, some eggs from her chickens. Blake noticed how little she took for herself, how she made sure Jack and Blake had full plates, even now, even with nothing. She practiced hospitality like it was a sacrament. You mentioned visiting prisoners, Blake said. Tell me about that. Ruth's face brightened slightly. I know them by name. Sheriff, their crimes, yes, but also their children, their regrets. their hopes for who they might become. She paused. Samuel Ortiz, you brought him in 2 years ago for cattle theft. Blake remembered. Surly man. Spit curses the whole ride to Prescott. He's learning to read now. Ruth continued. Wants to write letters to his daughter. She's 8 years old and doesn't remember him. Ruth smiled. He's trying to become someone she could be proud to know. Blake set down his fork. How do you know they're not just using you, taking your kindness and laughing about it later? Some are, Sheriff. Some take the food and throw away the books, but some enough use what I bring to feed something better in themselves. I don't need perfection. I just need possibility. She retrieved another letter from her shelf. This one. Not from Jack. Marcus Cole. You arrested him for rustling 3 years ago. Blake remembered Cole, too. Hard case. Unrepentant. Read it, Ruth said, handing him the letter. Dear Miss Ruth, it began. I wanted you to know I got work at the Henderson Ranch near Flagstaff. Been here 6 months now. Doing honest work with cattle instead of stealing them. Met a woman at church. We're getting married next month. I wanted to thank you for the book you brought me about farming, for believing I could be more than what I was. Your friend, Marcus Cole. Blake read it twice. This wasn't possible. Men like Cole didn't change, except apparently they did. When someone believed in them, when someone offered them more than judgment. Did he make it? Blake asked quietly. Ruth nodded. Wrote me again last month. His wife is expecting their first child. Blake felt something shifting in his chest. This was the midpoint. He realized the place where he had to choose. Continue being the sheriff who delivered prisoners efficiently, who believed in law without questioning what justice actually meant, or become something different, something harder, maybe sayakun, but also more true. What would you have me do? Blake asked us, and he was genuinely asking, not challenging, not testing, actually asking. I don't ask you to let him go, Ruth said carefully. I ask you to ensure he gets a fair trial, not a lynching. I ask you to present all the evidence, not just what makes conviction easy. I ask you to remember he's human before he's criminal. It sounded simple, but Blake knew it wasn't. A fair trial meant investigating, asking questions, possibly finding evidence that complicated the simple narrative. It meant going against community expectations, against the efficiency that had made him a respected lawman. It meant risking everything he'd built. Jack had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke. Sheriff Blake, I need to tell you something. Blake turned to him. The stage robbery, I wasn't alone. There were 3 others, the Garrett brothers. They said if I didn't help, they'd hurt Mama, burn her cabin. Jack's voice was steady, but Blake heard the fear beneath it. I tried to say no, but I was afraid. That's the truth. I was weak and I was afraid, and I did wrong because I couldn't bear the thought of them hurting her. Blake's blood went cold. The Garrett brothers. He knew those names, Wade, Chie, Clint, and Sam Garrett, violent men out of Tucson, suspected of 6 crimes worse than robbery. Did you tell anyone this? Blake asked. Who would believe me? I'm the outlaw. They're just suspects. Jack met Blake's eyes. I figured hanging was better than watching them hurt Mama. At least this way. She'd be safe. Blake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. If Jack was telling the truth and something in Blake's gut said he was, then this wasn't a simple robbery case. This was coercion, duress, possibly even false imprisonment. The legal calculus changed entirely. But proving it would mean investigating, would mean delaying justice. As the town would see it, would mean putting his career and reputation at risk for one outlaw's word against 3 others. Blake looked at Ruth. She sat quietly, hands folded, waiting, not pushing, not pleading, just present. The empty bucket outside caught his eye through the window. Ruth had filled it this morning, used the water for cooking. The bucket itself was worthless, rusted, old, forgotten, but filled with purpose. It served. Blake made his decision. I'm taking you to Prescott, he told Jack. But first, we're stopping in Tucson. I need to investigate your story. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Blake knew what this meant, knew he was crossing a line his father would have never crossed, knew he was choosing complexity over certainty. Mercy alongside justice, knew sister. Somehow, it was the right choice even if it cost him everything. They rode into Dusty Creek 3 hours later. Blake had meant to bypass the town, head straight for Tucson, but the road led through it, and there was no avoiding the main street. Word traveled fast in small towns. By the time Blake reached the center of town with Jack Sullivan shackled beside him, a crowd had gathered. "String him up here, Blake." Others joined in. Blake recognized the voices: Tom Fletcher, who ran the Mercantile, Henry Walsh from the saloon, even Pastor Donovan from the church. Good people. They called themselves upstanding citizens who believed in law and order. What they believed in was vengeance dressed up as justice. Mayor Hendricks stepped into the street, raising his hand for quiet. He was a big man, prosperous, used to being obeyed. "Sheriff Blake, we heard you spent the night at the Outlaw's mother's place. People are talking, wondering if you're going soft on crime." The threat was clear. Blake's position as sheriff depended on community trust. If they saw him as compromised, as lenient, his authority would evaporate. The council could remove him, find someone who'd give them the swift justice they craved. Blake felt the weight of their stares. This was the moment Ruth had prepared him for without ever naming it. He could give them what they wanted: deliver Jack to be hanged quickly. No questions asked, no complications. Keep his job, his reputation, his place in this community. Or he could do what was right. "The law requires a trial. Mr. Hendricks," Blake said, his voice carrying across the street. "Not mob judgment. I'm taking Mr. Sullivan to the territorial court in Prescott. If you have complaints about my methods, you can bring them to the territorial marshal." The crowd's murmur turned angry. Someone spat in the dust. Hendricks's face hardened, and Blake saw his political future being calculated in those eyes. "Your job is to protect this town, Blake, not to protect outlaws." "My job," Blake said carefully, each word chosen with precision, "is to uphold the law, all of it, including the parts about due process and fair trial." He nudged his horse forward before anyone could organize resistance. Behind him, he heard the anger in their voices, felt their eyes on his back like accusations. He'd crossed a line. They knew it. So did he. That night, camped between Dusty Creek and Tucson, Blake built a small fire and sat across from Jack, who remained shackled to a tree. The stars were bright overhead, indifferent to human struggles. "The Garretts," Blake said. "Tell me everything." Jack spoke slowly, choosing his words. "It started about 8 months ago. They came to Mama's cabin, said they needed a 4th man for a job, someone expendable, someone whose word wouldn't matter if things went wrong." He paused. "They knew about Mama, knew she was alone. Vulnerable. Wade Garrett, he's the worst of them. He told me exactly what they'd do to her if I refused. Details. Sheriff, things I won't repeat." Blake's jaw tightened. "I tried to run, tried to warn Mama, get her somewhere safe, but they followed us. Burned a cross in the yard one night as a warning." Jack's voice was hollow. "So I did the robbery, held the gun they gave me, took my share even though touching that money made me sick, and after, I tried to disappear, tried to get far enough away they'd forget about us. But they didn't. They found me in Phoenix 6 weeks later, said if I ever talked, Mama would pay. I believed them. Sheriff, I still believe them." Blake stared into the fire. If this was true and every instinct he had said it was, then Jack Sullivan wasn't just an outlaw. He was a victim, coerced through the cruelest possible means. The law recognized duress as a defense, as mitigation if not complete exoneration. But proving it would be nearly impossible. It was Jack's word against the Garretts. And who would believe an admitted criminal over 3 men who hadn't yet been convicted of anything? Blake would have to investigate, would have to find evidence, testimony, patterns, would have to do the work his position didn't technically require, that his community actively opposed, that might cost him everything and still fail to save Jack Sullivan from hanging. He thought about Ruth sitting in her poverty-stricken cabin, Maintaining dignity despite having nothing. Thought about those letters written in careful script, full of remorse and shame. Thought about Marcus Cole, reformed rustler expecting his first child. About Samuel Ortiz learning to read for a daughter who didn't remember him. Thought about what justice actually meant. Stripped of convenience and efficiency and community approval. I'm going to Tucson, Blake said. I'm going to find evidence. And if your story holds, I'm going to make sure you get a fair trial. Jack looked at him with something like hope, and it was the saddest thing Blake had ever seen. Thank you, Sheriff, Jack said quietly. Whatever happens, thank you for trying. Blake nodded and turned back to the fire, already making plans, already knowing this decision would cost him his badge, his reputation, possibly more, already knowing he'd made the right choice anyway. Tucson was 3 days' hard ride. Blake left Jack in the territorial jail there properly documented, legally held, no lynch mobs. Then he started investigating. The Garrett brothers weren't hard to find. They had a reputation. Blake spent 2 days talking to witnesses, tracking patterns, gathering stories. What he found confirmed Jack's account, and worse, the Garretts recruited desperate men, always men with families, always men who had something to lose. They'd threaten, coerce, use them for robberies, then discard them when convenient. Blake found 2 other men in the Tucson jail who told similar stories. Both had been caught. Both were serving time. Neither had dared name the Garretts. They'll kill my wife, one man said, his voice shaking. I take my punishment, keep my mouth shut, and maybe she stays safe. Blake talked to the territorial marshal in Tucson, a weathered man named Parsons, who'd been wearing a badge longer than Blake had been alive. You're risking your career for one outlaw's trial, Parsons said, shaking his head. Blake, even if you prove coercion, Sullivan still robbed that stage. Best case, he gets 20 years instead of hanging. Worst case, you lose your badge for overstepping jurisdiction, and he hangs anyway. Blake knew Parsons was right. The prudent thing would be to deliver Jack. Testify to what he knew. Let the judge decide. Walk away clean. Reputation intact, but prudence felt like cowardice now. Blake spent 3 days gathering evidence, witness statements about the Garretts threatening families, testimony from other coerced men, records of the Garretts' pattern of operation. It was painstaking work, and every hour he spent on it, he knew the town of Dusty Creek was turning against him. Knew Mayor Hendricks was probably calling for his removal, knew he was burning every bridge he'd built in 15 years of law enforcement. The crisis came on the 3rd night. Blake sat alone in a Tucson boarding house, his collected evidence spread across a small table, pages of testimony, witness statements, dates and patterns that proved the Garretts' coercion was systematic, deliberate, cruel. It still might not be enough. Blake thought about his father, also a lawman, also rigid in his certainty, beloved by his community for harsh but predictable justice. Blake had become a sheriff to honor that legacy, to prove he could be the kind of man his father respected. But Blake's father had died alone, bitter, estranged from Blake's mother, who'd left when she couldn't bear the hardness anymore. His certainty had protected the law but destroyed his family. Was that the legacy Blake wanted? To be right and efficient and utterly alone? He picked up his pen and wrote a letter he wasn't sure he'd send. Mrs. Sullivan, you asked me to see your son whole before I ended him. I have seen him, and I have seen myself reflected in that seeing. Whatever happens now, I am grateful for the lesson, even as I fear its cost. Respectfully, Morgan Blake. The next morning, Blake returned to Prescott with his evidence. The territorial judge, a stern man named Clayton who'd presided over 100 trials, reviewed Blake's findings with increasing displeasure. Sheriff Blake, you've overstepped badly. This investigation wasn't yours to conduct. You had no jurisdiction in Tucson. You've delayed justice, exceeded your authority, and embarrassed your town's leadership. Clayton's voice was hard. I could censure you for this. I know, Your Honor, Blake said steadily, but the evidence exists now. Will you ignore it? Clayton stared at Blake for a long moment. Blake met his eyes, refusing to look away. Finally, the judge sighed. No, I won't ignore it. But you've made yourself very unpopular. Sheriff Blake, the council from Dusty Creek sent a formal complaint. They want you removed. Clayton shuffled the papers. I hope your conscience is worth your career. Blake thought of Ruth's steady eyes, Jack's quiet shame, the empty bucket filled with water. Serving its purpose, thought of Marcus Cole expecting a child, Samuel Ortiz learning to read, all the men Ruth visited in prison who were trying to become better than what they'd been. It is, Your Honor. Blake said. It is. Clayton nodded slowly. Trial starts tomorrow. I'll review your evidence tonight. And Blake, he paused. What you did was improper, but it wasn't wrong. I hope you understand the difference. Blake left the courthouse knowing he'd probably lost his badge. Knowing the town he'd served for a decade wanted him gone. Knowing his reputation as an efficient lawman was destroyed. Knowing, somehow, that he was more at peace than he'd been in 15 years. The courtroom filled early. People came from Dusty Creek, from Tucson, from settlements Blake didn't recognize, all wanting to see the outlaw hang. Blake sat in the witness section, feeling their hostile stares. Mayor Hendricks was there with 3 council members. Their message was clear. You betrayed us. Jack Sullivan stood at the defendant's table, shackled, wearing clean clothes the jail had provided. He looked small in that space, young despite being nearly 40, broken by war and poverty and desperation. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named Sutherland, presented the case with theatrical flourish. The defendant robbed the Tucson stage. He admits this. He held a gun. He took money. The law is simple. Robbery is a crime. The penalty is death by hanging. Then Blake took the stand. Sutherland's cross-examination was brutal. Sheriff Blake, did Mr. Sullivan report this alleged coercion to authorities before his capture? No. Did he attempt to resist the Garretts in any way that left physical evidence? No. Isn't it convenient, Sheriff, that his claims of coercion only emerged after his capture? Isn't it more likely that this is simply a desperate man's lie to avoid just punishment? Blake met Sutherland's eyes. It could be. I believe it is not. I have interviewed other victims of the Garrett's operation. The pattern is consistent, documented, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. Belief, Sheriff. Is that what we base law on now? Your personal feelings about an admitted criminal. We base it on evidence and judgment, Mr. Sutherland. I have provided evidence. I trust the court's judgment. Blake presented everything: the witness statements, the pattern of coercion, the testimony from other victims, the Garrett's documented history of violence. Jack testified in his own defense, his voice steady even as he admitted his guilt. I robbed that stage. I knew it was wrong, but I did it because I was afraid of what they'd do to my mother if I refused. He looked directly at the jury. I'm not asking for freedom. I'm asking you to understand why a man who was raised to be good became someone who did wrong. Ruth sat in the gallery, small and straight in her threadbare dress. She didn't cry, didn't plead, just sat with quiet dignity, bearing witness to her son's truth. The judge deliberated for 2 hours. The courtroom buzzed with speculation. Blake sat rigid, feeling his career ending with each passing minute, feeling it and accepting it. Judge Clayton returned. The room fell silent. The court finds the defendant guilty of robbery. The evidence of coercion, while substantial, does not constitute complete defense. However, he paused, looking directly at Jack. The court accepts Sheriff Blake's evidence as significant mitigation. The defendant acted under duress, threatened by violent men targeting his family. The law recognizes this. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Sentence 15 years territorial prison, with possibility of parole after 7 years for good behavior and demonstrated rehabilitation. Not freedom, but not hanging. Someone in the gallery shouted that Blake was a disgrace. Others joined in. Blake didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Jack, who stood trembling, tears running down his face. Your Honor, Jack said, his voice breaking, I accept this sentence and thank the court for its mercy. Sheriff Blake, he couldn't finish. Blake nodded once, one man given a chance at redemption. It had cost Blake everything else to, but in this moment, it felt like enough. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Ruth approached. "You have lost much today." "Sheriff, maybe," Blake said. "Or maybe I found something I didn't know I'd lost." Ruth took his hand briefly, a rare gesture, weighted with meaning. "What you do with your changed heart, Sheriff, is up to you. But know this, you chose the harder path, the truer path, and that choice will echo in ways you cannot yet see." Blake watched her walk away, small and erect and utterly dignified despite everything. He thought, "She taught me that justice requires more courage than punishment ever did." The crowd dispersed. Blake stood alone in the fading light, feeling strangely light despite having lost his position, his reputation, his place in the community he'd served. He'd lost everything except his integrity, and somehow, that was enough. 3 months later, Blake rode toward Prescott with another prisoner. The young man, barely 19, sat shackled beside him, silent and afraid, horse theft this time. The ride mirrored his journey with Jack, the chains rattling, the dust on the road, the weight of duty, but everything had changed. Blake wore a different badge now, federal deputy marshal. The territorial marshal had offered him the position 2 weeks after the trial. "We need men who think before they act, Blake. Men who understand justice is more than just enforcement. There aren't many of us left." The work paid less, carried less prestige, required more travel, more judgment calls, more living in the gray spaces between law and mercy. Blake had never been happier. "What made you steal the horses?" Blake asked his prisoner. "The young man, Daniel?" His name looked surprised at being asked. "My father died 6 months back. Mama can't work the farm alone. No money for hired help. I thought—" He stopped, ashamed. "I thought I could sell them, get enough to hire workers for spring planting." Blake listened without judgment, heard the echo of Jack's story, of Ruth's explanation of how desperation makes beasts of good men. "You did wrong," Blake said finally. "That's not in question, but I'll make sure you get a fair trial. Tell the truth about your circumstances. The court will consider it." Daniel stared at him. "You're not going to call me scum, tell me I deserve hanging. I'm going to tell you that you made a choice in desperation, and now you face consequences. But consequences don't have to be the end of your story. They can be the beginning of a better one, if you let them." Blake thought of Jack, now 6 months into his sentence, working in the prison workshop learning carpentry. Ruth wrote occasionally brief letters reporting Jack was teaching other prisoners to read, that he was becoming someone his mother could recognize again, redemption taking root in the smallest ways. They rode through a small settlement where Blake stopped to water the horses. He noticed an empty bucket by the well. Without thinking, he filled it, carried it to a widow's door he'd passed, left it there with some coins tucked inside. Daniel watched this exchange, confused. "Why'd you do that?" "Because she needed it. Because I could. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about seeing people whole and responding to what we see." They continued toward Prescott. The sky was clear. The dust settled. Blake carried his duty differently now, not as armor against complexity, but as responsibility to serve humanity's highest possibilities. Ruth had taught him that law without mercy was just another form of violence, but mercy without accountability was just another form of chaos. The balance required wisdom he was still learning. He thought of the empty bucket, filled and useful, thought of his own certainty, emptied and refilled with something more nourishing: humility, curiosity, compassion that didn't excuse but did understand. The road stretched ahead. Blake rode it with eyes open to complexity, heart open to mercy, and hands still committed to justice, but justice transformed by wisdom, tempered by understanding, guided by the simple truth that everyone deserves to be seen whole before being judged. Ruth's lesson had taken root, and though Blake had lost his badge, his reputation, his community's approval, he'd gained something more valuable: the ability to serve justice more truly than his rigid certainty ever could. The ride continued, the law continued, but Blake had been transformed, and in that transformation he'd finally become the lawman his better self had always meant to be. 2/2 said.